My mom took my inheritance, married a younger man, and ended up begging me for mercy, and then, when I was a kid, my house always felt like a stage set for someone else's drama. While my classmates rolled their eyes about parents who worked late, I came home to a mother who couldn't stop broadcasting her hatred for every second she spent at her job. Camille, my mother, who insisted I call her Cam once I hit double digits, would march in from the accounting firm each evening with the ferocity of someone returning from battle. The door slammed, her handbag landed hard on the counter, and within seconds, the monologue would begin. "Nora, you would not believe the garbage I put up with today," she'd announce before even removing her heels. My boss, the walking necktie, actually had the audacity to critique my quarterly statements. Me, can you imagine? I'd usually nod along while silently finishing up my pre-algebra homework. I knew better than to engage too much, not unless I wanted to sit through a second act of her one-woman show. My dad, Troy, was the quiet force of calm in our home, a retail logistics manager who wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation and cared more about balanced budgets than about anyone's feelings. He didn't argue with her anymore. He'd just keep eating dinner, maybe throw out a line like, "Camille, if you hate it that much, maybe it's time to look for something else," always in the calmest, most unbothered tone possible. This only ever made things worse. Her fork would hit the plate, or her wine glass would swing a little too wide, and her voice would pitch up into something that made our cat vanish under the couch. "Another job? You think I want another job, Troy? I don't want to work at all. I want a goddamn life. A life I don't have to drag myself through." I was 10 at the time, but I knew how to read a room. My mom didn't want help. She wanted to be heard and worshipped for surviving the unfair tragedy of having to earn a paycheck. So, I learned to vanish behind my books, let her words wash over me while I memorized animal biology or pretended to understand algebraic expressions. The day everything changed was so painfully ordinary that the news hit like a slap. I still remember the plate of reheated pasta, the way my father was unusually quiet during dinner, how Cam was mid-rant about her co-worker's offensive breath when Dad dropped the fork and said, flatly, "My Uncle Felix passed away." The silence that followed wasn't sadness, it was calculation. Camille blinked once, then leaned forward, suddenly attentive. "Uncle Felix? The one in Kansas City?" she asked, as if trying to confirm it was the right one. Dad nodded and went back to his food. He left his estate to his nephews. "That includes me." And then came the question I knew she couldn't stop herself from asking. "How much are we talking?" He didn't look up when he said it. 180,000. The reaction was instant. Camille froze for half a second, and then something shifted in her eyes. Her usual complaint lines dissolved into a strange sort of smile. For the first time in what felt like years, she looked happy, almost human. "Troy," she whispered, reaching across the table, her red nails flashing under the light. "Do you know what this means? That little beach house on Tybee Island I've been dreaming about? We could finally—" "No," he interrupted, still calm, but firmer than usual. "No beach house. No endless shopping sprees. You said you wanted to be free. This is your chance." She blinked, her hand retracting like he'd burned it. "What are you talking about?" "I've been planning this for a long time," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "I want to start my own courier business. I already have contacts, a plan, everything. With this capital, we can build something that belongs to us." Camille laughed in disbelief. "A courier company? Like packages and delivery vans? Are you serious right now?" "You could quit your job and help with the accounts," he continued, ignoring her tone. "We'd be our own bosses. Build something from the ground up." She stared at him like he'd asked her to move to Mars. But then, after a long pause, I saw it happen. The gears turning behind her eyes, calculating if there was a way to spin this into something she could live with. "Fine," she finally said, her voice clipped. "But I'm doing the books. And when we make money, I want real things, Troy. No more coupons. No more Walmart clothes. I want my life to look like it belongs to someone who matters." He reached out and squeezed her hand gently. "Deal." That moment burned itself into my memory. My mother agreeing, albeit begrudgingly, to a plan that didn't revolve around her comfort, but around building something with my dad. It felt like the first fragile truce in a long war. For the next 3 years, our lives were swallowed by the business. My dad poured himself into it, working 16-hour days, driving across the state to court clients, handling logistics like his life depended on it. Camille, true to her word, kept the books, though she complained endlessly about the long hours and the lack of glamour in anything we did. As for me, I spent more afternoons at the office than at the playground. I'd do homework between the stacks of invoice folders or eat lunch next to the old fax machine. But even with all the chaos, there was something alive about those days. It was like watching two people drag their lives out of the mud with nothing but willpower and stubbornness. And it worked. It took almost exactly 3 years, but it worked. Suddenly, everything changed. Clients poured in. Profit margins rose. Bonuses appeared. We moved into a new 5-bedroom house in the nicer part of town. Troy bought 2 sleek, midnight blue sedans. Camille's smile returned, but not the kind I remembered. It was sharper now, more rehearsed, like she was performing wealth instead of living it. Then one morning, over her freshly brewed espresso and toast with imported jam, she said it. "I'm done," she announced, not looking up from her phone. Dad glanced up from the paper. "Done with what?" "The company," she said casually. "I'm not doing it anymore. You can hire someone else for the accounts. I'm retired." There was no fight, just a pause, a long sip of coffee, and Troy nodded. "Okay, I figured you'd say that sooner or later." And just like that, my mom officially became someone who didn't have to do anything anymore. She spent her days at country clubs and spas, flying to Aspen with women named Tasha and Elise, most of whom had never worked a day in their lives. Her old friends vanished. So did the quiet Sunday breakfasts, the board games, the chocolate chip pancakes. In their place were suitcases with airport tags still hanging off the handles and laughter that never included me. She was gone, even when she was home. And for the first time, I understood that being part of a family doesn't guarantee you a place in someone's life. By the time I turned 13, my mother had practically become a stranger in our own home. The woman who used to iron my school uniforms while humming along to old pop songs now barely remembered which grade I was in. Every week, she seemed to be packing for another quick girls' getaway, with women who called themselves boss babes, even though none of them had actual jobs. If she wasn't boarding a plane, she was at a spa, posting filtered selfies captioned with phrases like "earning my peace" or "self-care isn't selfish." Meanwhile, my dad and I were still living in the real world. Well, as real as it could be inside the shiny suburban home we now occupied, complete with a winding driveway and a pool we barely used. He was still putting in long hours at the courier company, making sure deliveries ran smooth, clients were happy, and employees didn't quit. Despite all the pressure, he never lost that calm, deliberate way he had of doing things. He didn't complain or crack under stress. He just worked, silently carrying the whole operation on his back, while my mom was out wine tasting in Sonoma with people who wore their sunglasses indoors. Most nights, I'd stay late at the office with him, pretending to do homework while secretly watching how he managed the team, the drivers, the routing software, the late-night customer emails. He never pushed me to take an interest, but when I started asking questions about fuel costs, delivery logistics, margins, his eyes would light up like someone had just remembered what hope felt like. I think he hoped I'd one day take it all over, maybe even make it better. But I had my own dreams, and eventually, I had to tell him the truth. One Friday afternoon, we were sitting in his cramped office, the only part of the building that still felt modest. He was scanning a set of revised delivery zones when I closed my notebook and said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." He turned slowly, giving me his full attention like he always did. "I don't think I want to run the company when I'm older," I said carefully, watching his face for any sign of disappointment. "I think I want to be a vet." There was a pause, and for a second I braced myself for a lecture about practicality or wasted potential, but it never came. Instead, his whole face softened into something warm and proud. "A veterinarian?" he said, sitting back in his chair. "Tell me more." And so I did. I told him how biology fascinated me, How every time I volunteered at the local shelter, I felt like I was doing something that mattered. I told him about my dream of opening a clinic one day, the kind with soft lighting and warm tea for nervous pet owners, a place that felt like hope instead of fear. He didn't just listen. He leaned in, nodding along, asking thoughtful questions about schooling and specializations. He never once made me feel like I was letting him down. That's the kind of father he was. He believed in me, even when it meant watching his own dreams take a different shape. At home, things continued their slow, inevitable unraveling. My mother had gone from present but annoyed to completely absent. Sometimes I'd wake up and find out she'd left for Brazil or Dubai without even saying goodbye. When she did come back, it was like she'd brought someone else's personality with her. Louder, flashier, colder. She always returned with new handbags, new jewelry, and a dozen stories about people I'd never meet, experiences I couldn't relate to, and spas that charged more for a facial than my dad spent on groceries. I stopped asking if I could go with her after the fourth or fifth time she told me, without looking up from her phone. "Sweetheart, these trips are for grown women who've earned a break. You'll understand when you're older. Family life drains you." As if she was some war hero coming home from battle instead of a woman who hadn't lifted a finger at home in years. The part that stung the most wasn't her distance. It was how unbothered she seemed by it. She never asked about my classes, never remembered when I had exams, never noticed the way I lingered in the doorway before she left, silently hoping she'd offer to stay, or maybe even ask me something as simple as, "How are you doing, kiddo?" Then, just when I thought I'd adjusted to this new normal, life swerved off the rails again. It was a Sunday evening, just after 7, when I made our usual video call home. My dad always answered right away, sitting in his recliner, his hair still damp from the shower, wearing one of his old baseball shirts. He'd lean in close to the camera, eager to hear about my coursework, the new clinic volunteer program, the wild rescue stories from the vet hospital. But that night, his eyes looked different, tired in a way I'd never seen. His voice wasn't as firm, and his smile felt forced. "Nora," he said, and I felt my stomach clench before he even said another word. "There's something I need to tell you." I don't remember how I sat through it. I only remember words like aggressive, stage 4, and 6 months. I remember feeling the ground fall away from me while I sat alone in a college dorm room lit by string lights and scented candles. He didn't cry, and he didn't beg for sympathy. That wasn't his style. Instead, he calmly told me he was going to sell the business, said it wouldn't be right to leave either of us with the burden of trying to run something we weren't ready for. Said he'd already found a buyer who respected what he built and would keep things going for the employees who depended on it. "I just want to make sure you're taken care of," he said gently. "And I want to leave things in order. That way, you won't have to worry." I tried to say something, anything, but no words came out. Those final months moved like a montage in slow motion. Visits back and forth between school and home, helping with hospice paperwork, watching my father become smaller and quieter, his once steady hands trembling as he buttoned his shirt. Camille was rarely around for any of it. She made a dramatic show of concern when people visited, hugging him tightly, crying delicate little tears in front of neighbors and church friends. But the moment she was alone, her mask slipped. I'd find her checking bank balances in the kitchen, flipping through property listings on her tablet, or leaving notes about which watch should go to which safe deposit box. She was more interested in dividing the empire than saying goodbye to the man who built it. And then, just like that, he was gone. It happened one cloudy morning. I was home for the weekend, sitting next to his bed, holding his hand and listening to the soft hum of oxygen that no longer helped. His breathing slowed, then stopped. No theatrics, no final words. Just a stillness that broke something in me I didn't know was fragile. Camille wasn't even in the house. She was at a spa in Sedona, getting her skin resurfaced. She didn't rush home when I called. She arrived 12 hours later in full makeup, oversized sunglasses, and a black cashmere shawl. She swept through the house like a storm, making calls to florists and caterers, telling people she was devastated as she scheduled manicures and called in favors for an elegant but tasteful service. The funeral was a performance. Camille wept into a satin handkerchief, leaned dramatically into the arms of her designer-clad friends, and shook her head at condolences like someone who had been tragically wronged by fate. I stood beside her, dry-eyed and numb, listening to the carefully chosen eulogy she had edited herself, one that made Troy sound like a successful banker with a yacht instead of the hard-working, kind-hearted man who used to leave love notes in her coat pockets and never raised his voice, even when she deserved it. And when the last car rolled away, when the neighbors were gone and the flowers began to wilt, she tossed her shawl onto the couch, fixed her lipstick in the mirror, and said the words that confirmed everything I'd suspected for years. "Well, that's done," she said briskly. "Now we need to talk about the money." I wanted to scream at her right then, right there in the living room where my dad's slippers still sat untouched under the recliner, but something inside me had already shut down. It was like my body had instinctively wrapped my grief in layers of ice, just so I could get through the moment without crumbling. Camille was already pacing in heels too high for our carpet, talking about international investment opportunities and rebranding, now that the business had sold and we were, as she so generously put it, finally liquid. "Think about it, Nora," she said with the kind of excitement people usually reserve for winning a game show. "We could buy that property in Seville I've been eyeing. You could visit during school breaks, or even move there eventually. Think of the culture, the wine, the lifestyle. We don't have to stay chained to this dreary state anymore." I didn't respond. I just stood there, staring at her as the distance between us became a canyon I knew we'd never cross. The woman who used to tuck me in with bedtime stories was now acting like my father's death was an inconvenience to be managed before her next European escapade. Days later, we sat together at the notary's office for the reading of Dad's will. The place smelled like stale printer ink and disinfectant, and the lawyer, a gray-haired man named Saul who had known Dad for years, kept his tone professional, but even he couldn't completely hide the discomfort on his face. Camille showed up in another black designer dress, not the one from the funeral, of course, but something new with a label still half-tucked in the back. She tapped her nails against her leather clutch as if the entire process was beneath her. Saul began with the usual preamble, confirming identity, flipping through pages like a man stalling for time before detonating a bomb. "The house is to be divided equally," he read, "between Camille and Nora." The tapping paused briefly. "A trust has been created for Nora's continuing education in veterinary medicine, covering all academic and living expenses through the completion of her doctorate." Her posture stiffened. "The remainder of the estate, including proceeds from the sale of the business, investments, and savings, is to be divided as follows: 60% to Nora and 40% to Camille." The silence was immediate, jagged, and heavy enough to stretch the room like taut wire. Then, her voice, a sharp blend of disbelief and performance. "This is outrageous," she snapped, her tone rising with each syllable. "There must be some mistake. Troy would never do this to me." Saul didn't flinch. "There is no mistake. Your husband was explicit in his instructions and revised this document 3 months ago." She turned to me, lips curled into a practiced expression that probably worked on her new friends but felt utterly artificial in this moment. "Nora, honey, you have to see how unfair this is. Your school's already covered, and you'll be making plenty of money once you're licensed. I'm your mother. I need to maintain my lifestyle." For a long second, I just looked at her. Something inside me shifted, like a lock turning for the final time. I had watched her ignore my father's slow death, watched her prioritize Monty Python over medicine schedules, watched her pick spa robes over hospital gowns. She had chosen everything but us. She had abandoned the role of mother long before she demanded to be called one. "Maybe try spending less," I said, the words slipping out before I could filter them. It wasn't a shout or even anger, just honesty. Her mask slipped instantly. Her entire face twisted with fury, so raw I almost stepped back. "How dare you," she hissed. "After everything I've sacrificed for you. Do you think any of this would exist without me? What exactly have you sacrificed?" I asked, my voice steady now. "You haven't worked in nearly a decade. Dad built this. You just benefited." She stood abruptly, snatching her purse and coat with a dramatized flair that would have impressed any casting director. When you decide to stop being ungrateful and selfish, you know where to find me. She slammed the door behind her hard enough to rattle the framed degrees on the wall. I didn't cry. I didn't chase after her. I just sat there and watched Saul quietly slide the paperwork into a folder and offer it to me with the kind of silent respect that made me feel like a real adult for the first time. "She'll come around," he said softly. "Or she won't. Either way, your father wanted you protected." Weeks passed. She didn't call. She didn't email. The silence was so complete that at first it felt like a wound, but slowly it started to feel like peace. I buried myself in classes, focused on my rotations at the university clinic, and told myself she would get over it eventually. But deep down I knew this wasn't a spat. It was a fracture that had been widening for years and had finally snapped. Then one night, after a full shift assisting emergency procedures on a rescued greyhound, I sat down to scroll through my phone and saw a photo that froze my blood. It was her, tanned, grinning, leaning into the chest of a man who couldn't have been more than 35. His teeth were perfect, his suit too tight, and her caption was the final punch. "Finally married to my soulmate. Love wins. Cam and Jules." I dropped the phone. For several long seconds I couldn't breathe. Married. She had gotten married without telling me, without inviting me, without even sending a text. My father's body wasn't even cold in the ground for a full year, and she had already replaced him. Publicly, flamboyantly, shamelessly. I called her, hands shaking so badly I missed the dial button twice. Straight to voicemail. That night, I barely slept. Images of her laughing with her new husband while my dad lay in a grave spun in my head like a cruel movie I couldn't pause. By morning, I'd packed a weekend bag and bought the earliest flight home. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just needed to see it for myself, to hear from her mouth how she justified this betrayal. The house looked exactly the same when I pulled up, as if time had decided to pause in every corner but my heart. My father's rose bushes were still perfectly trimmed. The wind chime he installed still swayed gently near the porch. But the red sports car parked in the driveway, that was new, and loud, just like her. She answered the door in a silk robe I'd never seen before, her surprise quickly dissolving into hostility when she registered who was standing on her porch. "Nora," she said, voice laced with annoyance. "What are you doing here?" I stepped inside before she could stop me. "I saw the photo. You got married." She rolled her eyes. "And no one invited you." Before I could respond, Jules, or Julian, I wasn't sure yet, appeared behind her, wrapping an arm around her waist like they were posing for a reality show promo. "Who's this?" he asked casually. She smiled, tight and smug. "Nobody important. Just my daughter. The one who thinks she can control my life." I stood there, stunned silent, watching as the woman who raised me became completely unrecognizable. She didn't flinch when I mentioned Dad. She didn't show a hint of shame. "Oh, honey," she laughed coldly. "You really thought all those trips were about me time? Julian and I have been together for years. Your dad was too busy counting shipping invoices to notice anything." I think I said something, probably something weak and sad like, "How could you?" But I barely remember. The last thing I remember clearly was her voice going ice cold as she stepped toward me. "This is our house now. And unless you plan on playing nice, you're not welcome in it." "This is half my house," I reminded her, gripping my bag to keep from shaking. "Not anymore," she said. "You'll see." She slammed the door in my face before I could respond. I stood on the porch for a long time, hearing the muffled laughter from inside, wondering how long this stranger had been hiding inside the woman who once braided my hair before school. It was only when I reached my rental car that the tears finally came. Not from sadness, at least not only sadness, but from the rage of realizing that the only parent I had left had been a fraud for years. I didn't expect to hear from her again, and honestly, I preferred it that way. After what happened at the house, after hearing her voice laced with venom and arrogance, I figured we'd reached the final chapter of whatever was left between us. I flew back to school, threw myself into my studies, and tried to seal off that entire part of my life like an old wound that would hurt more if picked open. But life, of course, doesn't always respect your boundaries. About a month after the confrontation, I got a phone call from Mrs. Grayson, our old neighbor who used to water the plants when we went out of town. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but I still had her number saved under the nickname Lemon Pie Lady from when I was 8. "Nora, honey, I didn't know who else to call," she said, and immediately I knew something was wrong. "What happened?" I asked, already on edge before she could finish the sentence. "I was out walking, Max, this morning, and there were moving trucks in front of your house. Big ones. They were hauling out furniture, boxes, everything. There's a sold sign on the lawn. I thought you should know." It took me a full 30 seconds to understand what she was saying. I gripped the phone tighter, trying to keep my voice calm even though my chest was starting to burn. "That's not possible," I said slowly, pacing my tiny apartment like it would help me stay rational. "She can't sell the house. It's half mine. My name is on the deed." "Well, I don't know what's going on, sweetheart," Mrs. Grayson said, clearly distressed. "But they're clearing the place out like someone handed them the keys." I hung up without saying goodbye. I was already calling my mother before the phone hit my bed. I didn't expect her to answer, not after the last time, but she picked up on the first ring. Her voice was disgustingly smug. Well, if it isn't my studious daughter," she said, the sarcasm practically dripping through the phone. "What do I owe the honor? What the hell is going on with the house?" I said, cutting straight to it. "You sold it? Without my consent?" She laughed. That same sharp, humorless sound I'd come to dread. "Oh, that. Yes, Brad and I. Excuse me, Julian and I got a fantastic offer. The market's hot right now. You can't do that. I legally own half of it," I said, feeling my voice start to rise. "Well, funny thing about that," she said, her voice light, almost giddy. "Turns out it's not that hard to forge a signature. You should really invest in better ink for your printer. Your signature was a dream to replicate. Took me all of 3 practice tries." I stood there frozen, phone pressed to my ear, unable to speak. My mouth was open, but nothing came out. "You forged my name?" I finally whispered, stunned by how casual she sounded about committing a felony. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said with a bored sigh. "If you hadn't been so selfish with the inheritance, maybe I wouldn't have had to resort to such methods. But you left me no choice, Nora. Brad, Julian, he deserves to live somewhere beautiful. And I deserve a life I enjoy." "You're out of your mind," I said, my voice flat now, not even angry, just hollow. She didn't miss a beat. "You're just bitter because you're alone, wasting your life in some boring clinic playing nursemaid to dogs while I'm out here living. I bought Julian a Jaguar with the money. The man's never been happier." "You mean my money," I said quietly. "You're giving my father's money to some guy who didn't even know him." "He knows how to make me happy," she snapped. "Which is more than I can say for your father. Always so serious, always saving, always planning. He never knew how to live." I felt something in my chest crack. "You betrayed him," I said. "And you're proud of it." She didn't respond. For the first time during the call, the line went quiet. "You don't get to lecture me about betrayal, little girl," she said finally, venom returning to her tone. "You were never on my side. Always Daddy's little perfect angel. You think I didn't notice? You think I didn't see how you looked at me like I was some kind of monster?" "You are a monster," I said. And then, because I couldn't stand hearing her voice for another second, I hung up. I didn't sleep that night. My head was full of courtroom scenarios and possible legal battles. I looked up real estate fraud laws, reviewed our shared deed, and booked a consultation with a lawyer the next morning. The damage was already done, the house was gone, but I still wanted to know what my options were. The attorney said I had a case, but it would be messy. Proving the forgery might take months, years even. And just when I started accepting that I might have to fight this battle in court, the universe decided to hand me a gift I didn't see coming. She came back. It was an ordinary Tuesday. I had just gotten home from the clinic, still in my scrubs, hair tied back with a pin stuck through it. My feet were sore, my back ached, and I was halfway through microwaving leftover lasagna when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I figured it was a delivery, maybe the new bedding I'd ordered, but when I looked through the peephole, my blood turned to ice. It was her, but not the version of her I remembered. The woman standing on my porch didn't look like the one who wore diamonds to the grocery store or posted filtered photos from Mykonos. Her hair was frizzy, the roots gray and unruly. Her designer coat had been replaced with a wrinkled trench, and her lipstick had bled outside the lines. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. "Nora," she whispered, voice shaking. "Please, I need your help." Before I could respond, she pushed past me into the apartment, her eyes scanning the space like she was searching for valuables. "Brad, Julian, he's gone," she said, her voice breaking mid-sentence. "He left me. Took everything." I didn't say a word. I just stared at her while she began unraveling like a loose thread pulled too far. "He gambled it all," she said. "The money, the cars, everything. Then he met some 20-year-old in Cancun and disappeared. Took the Jaguar, the last of our savings. I had to sell my jewelry just to buy a ticket home." She sat down on my couch without asking, burying her face in her hands. "I know I made mistakes," she said between sobs. "But I'm your mother. Please, just let me stay here for a few nights." For a moment, I felt something stir in me. Maybe pity, maybe a flicker of old loyalty. But it was buried under months, no, years of her lies, her coldness, her choices. I almost laughed. "You want to stay here?" I said, not even bothering to keep the disgust out of my voice. She looked up, face blotchy, eyes desperate. "I have no one else, Nora. Please." I pulled out my phone from my back pocket. "What are you doing?" she asked, wary now. "Just reminding you," I said, pulling up the saved audio file. "What you said to me on the phone." I hit play. Her own voice filled the room, echoing through my quiet little apartment. Turns out it's not that hard to forge a signature. The color drained from her face so quickly, I thought she might faint. She stood up, hands shaking. "You recorded that?" I looked her in the eye and didn't blink. Dad taught me to always be prepared. She opened her mouth, probably to threaten me again, but I cut her off before she could get the words out. "If you ever contact me again, or if I so much as hear that you've spoken my name, this recording goes to the authorities. I have legal backing. I have a lawyer. And I have zero tolerance left for your manipulations." She stared at me for a few long seconds. And for the first time in years, I saw fear. Not anger, not smugness, actual fear. Without another word, she grabbed her bag, walked to the door, and turned around just once. "I'm still your mother," she said, voice hollow now. "No," I replied softly. "You're just the woman who gave birth to me. My mother died a long time ago." Then I closed the door, and I locked it. I stood there for a long time after she left, my hand still resting on the doorknob like part of me needed to feel something solid, something unmoving. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was clean, like fresh air after a storm that's been raging for far too long. I didn't cry. I didn't rage or collapse or call someone to talk about it. I just stood there and breathed. For the first time in what felt like years, I could breathe without someone else's shadow crowding the space around me. Later that night, I pulled out the old photo album my dad had made when I was younger, the one he kept updated until he got sick. It had this worn leather cover that smelled like the attic, with little silver corners he added himself because he said pictures deserve protection too. I hadn't touched it since the funeral. Maybe because I couldn't bring myself to see the faces I missed, or maybe because I was scared to see the ones I didn't. There was a photo near the front, one I always lingered on longer than the others. It was from a beach trip we took when I was maybe 7. Dad had sunburn on his nose, and I was holding a plastic pail like it was treasure. Camille was smiling, wearing a straw hat and sunglasses that matched her swimsuit, and for once, it wasn't a pose. We actually looked like a family. Happy. Or maybe I just wanted to believe we were. I ran my finger over my dad's face, over his crooked smile and tired eyes. "I miss you," I whispered, because it was the only thing that ever felt consistent in my life. Missing him never got easier. I just got better at carrying it. The following months passed quietly, and that was exactly what I needed. I graduated with honors, completed my residency at the clinic, and used the remaining inheritance to open my own veterinary practice in a smaller town where people still remembered your name after one visit. It was modest, nothing flashy, nothing corporate, but it was mine. I made sure the waiting room was warm and welcoming, with real plants, not fake ones, and soft lighting instead of those harsh fluorescents that made everyone look tired. I hired a small team that felt more like a second family than coworkers, and for the first time in forever, I didn't feel like I was constantly waiting for something to go wrong. Occasionally, people would ask about my mom, especially the few who knew me well enough to know I wasn't close to her. I always gave the same answer, simple, calm, and clean. We're not in touch. I never felt the need to elaborate. I wasn't interested in digging through the ashes of a burned-out bridge just to prove there was once a path there. Sometimes I wondered where she went after that night. Did she find another man to manipulate? Did she finally run out of charm, of money, of stories? Did she ever regret what she did? Not just to me, but to my father, to herself? I'll never know, and I've made peace with that. I stopped checking for updates. I stopped looking for her name online. I stopped expecting her to apologize or show up again with another sob story in tow. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that not all ghosts are dead. Some of them just live in the choices we didn't make, the doors we refused to open, the people we walked away from to save ourselves. One day, a young girl came into my clinic with her elderly terrier and asked if I had any kids. I smiled politely and said no, not yet, maybe someday. She said I seemed like someone who'd be a good mom. That night, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea and thought about what that really meant. Being a mother isn't about giving birth, it's about showing up. It's about being present, being dependable, being kind when it's hardest. Camille gave me life, but she never gave me those things. Troy did. He wasn't perfect. He worried too much. He worked himself to the bone. He let her walk all over him in the early years. But he loved me without condition. He listened when I spoke. He encouraged my dreams even when they didn't match his own. And he stayed. Always. That's the kind of parent I want to be if I ever become one. Eventually, I donated the photo album to a fireproof memory box I keep in the back of my closet. Not because I want to forget, but because I want to remember only what matters. The smile on my dad's face. The feeling of sunlight on that beach. The warmth of being loved with no strings attached. That's the part of my story I carry with me now. The rest, the fraud, the betrayal, the mess, those are just chapters one lived through, not the ones that define me. Camille may have walked out of my life, but she didn't get to walk away with who I am. I built that myself.